Good evening and welcome to episode 10 of COP28 Covered, a weekend edition of the show that cuts through the complexities and keeps you fully briefed on the climate summit here in Dubai. It is Saturday, the 9th of December, and it's once again just me, Edie's publisher Luke Nichols, talking us through the day's events today because Matt and Sarah are back home reacclimatising and covering the key COP announcements from the comfort of their Christmas jumpers. But the temperature certainly hasn't dropped here in Dubai, and neither have the pace of the announcements because today's show is all about the COP theme of nature, land use and oceans. There have been some significant announcements on this theme made here today and over the last few days actually, which we're going to be digging into with the help of Sarah, of course. And I've been out and about here with the podcast mic to bring you exclusive interviews with the hugely impactful Business for Nature Coalition and the investor network that is the FAIRR Initiative. Plus, Sarah's going to be bringing us another edition of What's Hot and What's Not from the day's announcements and a fun stock take story time to close off the show. All of that coming up in today's episode of COP28 Covered. Yes, welcome back to COP28 Covered, hosted in collaboration with the UN's Race to Zero campaign. I hope everyone's having a lovely weekend. Now, there is no such thing as a COP28 weekend here because today was in fact one of the busiest days I've experienced at the summit because I'm currently sat within a bustling green zone. You can probably hear the music of the Al Wasl Dome, which is lit up behind me, and actually various protesters making their way down one of the central pathways here. It's a very peaceful protest, I must say, but there are hundreds of people here with placards and signs, mostly in relation to land rights and indigenous communities. I saw signs including no to false solutions, how many coffins for emissions reductions, and pay up for loss and damage. So it's certainly hotting up here in Dubai, and tensions are starting to mount, I think, as we approach the final run-in. Now, as I mentioned, today is Nature Day here at COP, so there have been loads of discussions across the various pavilions here in both the green zone and the blue zone, all connected by this overarching theme of achieving a nature-positive future and restoring biodiversity. I've sat in on a few of those discussions and I've also spoken to various people here on the sidelines throughout the day, but all of that has meant that I haven't really had a chance to stick my head above the parapet and find out what's actually going on at a higher level here at COP with regards to the broader negotiations and that all-important negotiation text. So where exactly are we with the whole fossil fuel phase out versus phase down sticking point, and what else has been announced here to advance the COP agenda today? If you're a regular listener, you'll know where I'm going with this because thankfully this is the point that Sarah steps in and guides us through the day's developments with her fan favourite What's Hot and What's Not from COP28 in Dubai, all from her home back in the UK. So Sarah, I'm going to hand over to you now. I was told by someone earlier that as well as this being Nature Day at COP28, the 9th of December is also in fact Gingerbread Decorating Day. Please tell me you've been following the big COP announcements from home and haven't just been building an Al Wasl Dome shaped gingerbread house?
Thanks, Luke, and hello everyone listening from rainy Sussex. I can confirm I'm not building any kind of gingerbread today because I am working, but I have tomorrow off. I'm passing the baton over to Matt Mace, our editor. So Luke, you have given me a cracking idea of what to do with my free time. So icing and gumdrop buttons pending. But for today, I've been keeping an eye on everything that's been going on in Dubai from a distance to bring you Saturday's What's Hot and What's Not at COP. In terms of what's hot, I have to start with the biggest move from the COP28 presidency on the theme of the day, nature. It has launched a new vision to align the agendas for the climate COPs and the biodiversity COPs from the UN, and it has the backing of 16 other nations in doing so, including the USA, the UK, Canada, Brazil and Colombia. And all other nations are being asked to consider supporting this before COP finishes next week. So the vision is called the Joint Statement on Climate, Nature and People. It stipulates that nations should align action both domestically and internationally on the Paris Agreement and on the UN Biodiversity Treaty. A reminder that that treaty was ratified in December 2022 and essentially sets out measures to get us to ending nature destruction by 2030. Nations are being encouraged to update and align the documents they publish under the Paris Agreement, including NDCs, National Action Plans on Finance, and also nature-based solutions action plans under the Biodiversity Treaty. So second in what's hot is the fact that multilateral development banks, including the European investment banks, have published their first set of common principles for defining, measuring and scaling nature-positive finance. These principles were first promised 2 years ago at COP26 at Glasgow. It's significant because the UN has today confirmed that $7 trillion of finance mostly from the private sector, is flowing to activities which are nature negative, so actively harming nature. So we're talking about things like mining and tobacco production. The long-term hope with the new principles for multilateral development banks is to mainstream nature in their operations in a systemic matter. So fingers crossed that we can see that coming to fruition from next year, when the European Investment Bank will be the first to integrate these new principles. And in terms of what's not hot at COP, observers say that negotiations are lagging on adaptations, even as they start to firm up on that crucial issue of fossil fuel phase out versus phase down. We know that the nearing decision on fossil fuels has really put the frighteners on OPEC, which is present at COP and has sent a letter to all of its member nations essentially saying, don't you dare back a fossil fuel phase out. But that looks ever more likely as the hours go on. Talks are still teetering on a knife edge, but nonetheless observers are saying that there's been less progress on adaptation. The UN published an adaptation gap report last month, warning that current annual levels of international climate adaptation funding might need to be 18 times bigger in 2030 than they were in 2021 if we don't scale up actions around both mitigation and adaptation. 21 billion was provided in 2021. The UN thinks that up to 387 billion could be needed in 2030. Also, what's not hot is the UK. So I'm recording this at about 4 p.m. UK time. It's just stopped raining. It's already dark here. It's extremely windy. So before I bring a chill to the episode, I'll hand over back to you, Luke, in sunny Dubai.
Great stuff. Thank you, Sarah. And all of those announcements are once again covered on the ed.net website, and we're going to be hearing again from Sarah at the end of the show. Now, let's crack on with this packed episode then, because we have got 2 nature-themed interviews to bring you to tie in with today's theme. As Sarah's just mentioned in her run-through, there have been some notable nature-related announcements coming through today. And whilst all that was happening, I sat down with 2 people who represent 2 critical areas of this nature discussion when it comes to actually mobilising and scaling action around nature-based solutions and biodiversity. Firstly, I headed over to the Nature Pavilion itself in the Blue Zone, where I met with Eva Zaby, who is the Chief Executive of Business for Nature. I'm sure many listeners will know Business for Nature. They're the global coalition that brings together just over 85 businesses now to drive credible business action and policy ambition to achieve a nature-positive economy for all by 2030. So I spoke with Eva about that and about her views on this COP process so far. And then I moved to the pavilion just next door to speak with Sajeev Mohan Kumar, who is a Senior Technical Specialist for Climate and Biodiversity for the FAIRR Initiative. That's FAIRR. And FAIRR is a huge investor network that raises awareness of the ESG risks and opportunities, specifically in the global food sector. So that was a really interesting chat with Sajeev about the role of the investor community in these nature discussions, and also the huge shift that we need to see from food businesses over the coming years off the back of this COP. So 2 great conversations for you to listen through this weekend. Let's play them both back to back now. Here's my chats with Eva from Business to Nature and Sajeev from the FAIRR Initiative in full. Yes, here I am then in the Nature Pavilion, right on the edge of the Blue Zone, and I'm here now with the Chief Executive of Business for Nature, Eva Zaby. Eva, hello, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast. Maybe start by talking to us about your COP experience so far.
Thanks so much. Well, actually, I've been having a pretty positive experience. It seems to me like everyone's having a slightly different experience, but from my side, I am very encouraged because, first of all, nature is included much more in the conversations, and I just get a sense that we're at a turning point of looking after our planet becoming much more mainstream. There's a maturity and a fluency with which companies are talking about the topic that I've never actually seen before at a climate COP. I also see much greater collaboration and convergence. It feels also, because of the scale of what we're trying to tackle across all these interconnected crises, that there's enough work across all of our organizations to support companies and financial institutions, and therefore it makes more sense for us all to make sure we are consistent and coherent in what we're all asking of companies. So overall, apart from being quite hot, that's really my takeaway for now.
It's baking hot outside, although thankfully inside this nature pavilion it's not. We've got nice air conditioners around us. You mentioned there, Evie, a lot of this is about the fact that nature is quite well embedded, I think, into some of the conversations across this COP, such as, loss and damage, renewables, even the broader phase out, phase down kind of conversation we're happening around fossil fuels at the moment. I wanted to get your take on that, like whether nature at climate summits like this and at government and business conversations needs to be discussed in and of itself, or is it better to be kind of discussed and woven in naturally into those kind of broader other elements?
Yeah. Well, I think in an ideal world, these would all be interconnected challenges that are addressed together. So it's already a great step forward that nature and biodiversity loss are included in the climate conversations. The potential risk with that is it is only limited to climate mitigation and adaptation, rather than also addressing the fact that we need to halt and reverse nature loss, and we need to drive towards an equitable world. So overall, it's definitely a massive step in the right direction, and I feel that it is showing us the direction that increasingly we will be taking a more holistic approach, looking at all these interconnected challenges. And in a way, it doesn't matter which entry point you use when you start looking at what needs to happen to reach a nature-positive, net-zero, equitable world. It doesn't matter if you start with regenerative agriculture, regenerative landscapes. There's been a lot of talk of food systems, health, renewable energy transition, whatever it is, so long as that might be your door to enter the conversation because it's the most relevant, but then you recognize all the other solutions that need to be tackled together.
And this is the first climate COP in which parties have a finished sort of biodiversity treaty in place. Is that treaty on the table to the extent that you'd like it to be here?
I have heard so it is on the table. The Global Biodiversity Framework, I've seen a shift because of the agreement in December at this climate COP. It has made a difference because of the clarity of the mission in the framework and all the different targets. It's elevated the fact that we need the national plans for climate and biodiversity together, and countries are now mandated before the next biodiversity COP to have updated their national biodiversity strategies and action plans. So there are a number of sessions here that are taking place, actually sometimes at quite a high level, on how do countries develop their climate and biodiversity strategies at the same time, because you're going to get win-wins and you also have to be conscious of potential trade-offs. So I have seen that on the agenda. The fact that there is the framework has also increased nature up the business and finance agenda, and that in turn is feeding into the conversations because companies are now getting ready with how they're going to contribute.
Yeah, so the foundations have been set in quite a nice way, I think, coming into this COP. We're in the final stretch now of this COP. I can't believe I'm saying that. There's been a lot of announcements and ongoing discussions here at all levels. So I know this can be quite a difficult thing to sort of pin down, but what for you would a good COP look like? What are you looking for specifically to come out of Nature Day and the next couple of days?
Well, along with all of the other partners in this Nature Positive Initiative, and there's a great pavilion here that maybe you've mentioned. It's been a fantastic effort. We've come together to really identify three key asks from this climate COP, which is: one, we need to increase the finance; two is we need to halt deforestation and protect and restore all ecosystems; and then third is to ensure the rights and the land tenure of indigenous peoples and local communities. In fact, I would say that last one has been incredibly visible, and the message is very well heard here in Dubai on the importance of putting people more broadly and indigenous communities and farmers at the centre of the conversation.
That's interesting. So you do feel that third point is being quite well adopted, listened to here at this COP?
Well, adopted is a big word. It's been shared and definitely heard by a number of stakeholders. Whether or not it will be reflected in the right way is yet to be seen.
Okay, and I realised we've jumped straight into the conversations all about nature here at COP, perhaps rightly, but I do want to step back and just recap really on your work and the great mission you've got there with Business for Nature. How are things going, and what is your mission looking like as we move into 2024?
Yeah, so as Business for Nature is a global coalition, our whole aim is to drive business action and policy ambition towards a nature-positive economy for all by 2030. So up until the biodiversity COP15 in December, we were really focused on making sure that we were sharing the right policy asks and contributing in a positive way to what has become a very ambitious framework. And since then, we've shifted our focus to make sure that companies know how they can and should scale and speed up action. And there are a couple of really cool pieces of work that I would invite everyone listening to contribute to. The first is that with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and World Economic Forum and Business for Nature, with all of us together, we developed sector-specific action. So we've cut through that complexity and based on really rich roadmaps and detailed transition plans, but said, okay, if you really had to synthesize for 12 sectors, what are the top impacts on nature, what are the top dependencies, and what are the priority actions that you can be sure you need to take to contribute to a nature-positive future? And that's really important because it is all about the action, and we can't get stuck in 3 years' time with companies still finishing their materiality assessment, having spent all their resources doing that and not left enough resources to take the action. And the second really exciting piece is called It's Now for Nature. This is a joint global collaborative campaign that we just launched ahead of COP28. And it's, again, focused on scaling and speeding up action, but it is centered around companies having a strategy for nature. All companies need to know what is their forward-looking plan of how they're going to contribute to halting and reversing nature loss by 2030. So accompanying this whole campaign is a nature strategy handbook that builds on all of this consistent work that we've been doing over the years, asking the right questions you can bring to the board, and then making sure that there's clarity on what we recommend is in a strategy. Just to be clear, we're not saying you need to have a standalone nature strategy. It can be part of your climate or sustainability or business strategy. You just have to have a plan. And then once you've developed and published it, you can submit it to the nowfornature.org website. And what we want to see over time to 2030 is massive snowball effect of increasing exponential number of strategies from all sectors or geographies as a proxy, if you want, for the action that is taking place. Because we know from evidence that companies with strategies on something are way more likely to take action. So, of course, it's going to be relatively high level, but this is what collectively across our whole coalition we're bringing forward to COP16 in the first instance. So you'll have governments with their plans and business and finance with their plans, and coming to see how we can then really be ramping up action starting right now.
Yeah, Now for Nature is a very fitting way of putting things here at this COP on this day and on this themed episode of COP28 covered. Eva, thanks so much for your time here. I'm sure we'll remain in close contact outside of this COP as that campaign progresses. For now, I'm going to hand straight on to my next interview. Yes, and usually moving from one meeting to another here at this COP takes a good half an hour and a few thousand steps, such is the size of this site. But as luck would have it, I've only had to just walk across from my last chat there with Eva to the adjacent building here within the Blue Zone into this, the Food for Climate Pavilion. And I'm delighted to be sat here in this pavilion with Sajeev Mohan-Kumar, who is the Senior Technical Specialist for Climate and Biodiversity at the FAIRR, or FAIRR Initiative, which is a UK-based network of investors which raises awareness of ESG risks and opportunities in the global food sector. Sajeev, hello. Perhaps we could just start there briefly with the work of FAIRR. Give us a sense of the scale of the FAIRR Initiative and its main aims as an organisation.
Yeah, as you rightly said, I think FAIRR is an investor network. So we have over 400 investor members comprising of some of the largest asset owners, asset managers, pension funds, philanthropies, etc. And covering around over $70 trillion. So a massive scale, if you ask about scale. And our main aim is essentially to advance ESG issues in the animal protein sector. And in summary, I would say at FAIRR, we use our investor members as a conduit to change corporate business practices and also influence policy.
Okay, interesting. And so I guess for the 10 minutes we've got here then we can chat a little bit about this interplay of global climate change, financial systems, food production, but also the nature and biodiversity element of this conversation as well, especially given the theme of the day here at COP and this episode of the podcast. So on the food and agricultural side of things, a lot of the work that FAIRR does is mapping the financial risks posed by climate change. What has your work and research shown you about the magnitude of the financial risks that the meat and dairy sector is likely to face under the different current scenarios we can see with regards to global warming?
So last year we released a tool for investors called the Climate Risk Tool. So that looks at 40 of the largest livestock producers and sees what influence climate change has on their financial materiality. So what we found was that, we looked at 3 scenarios. We looked at a couple of factors like animal feed prices, carbon tax, and heat stress on livestock productivity. And what we saw was that if you are looking at the 2 degrees Celsius scenario or business as usual scenario, some of these companies, the 40 companies in the whole, is going to have losses around 7%, which equates to around $23 billion by 2030, which rises up to $38 billion by 2050. So it's quite significant in terms of the risks that climate change poses for financial materiality for these companies. So it's a huge, huge opportunity also to do something about averting some of these climate risks to ensure profitability for these companies moving forward.
And I suppose those billions go up and up if global warming was to go above 2 degrees. Have you also mapped further out? I know it's not a nice way of looking at it, but...
Yeah, we also have a high impact scenario where the losses are even significant. So we looked at 3 scenarios, essentially, like the business as usual, the high impact scenario, and a net zero land scenario.
Interesting. And so I guess logically, investors in this area should then be kind of considering diversifying their portfolios towards those more sustainable, environmentally friendly food producers. What are the key things then that investors will be looking out for that would demonstrate if one food producer is a more secure investment than another from a climate perspective?
I think what they look for is a risk assessment undertaken by some of the companies to understand what are some of the material commodities or key sourcing regions or high biodiversity risk regions that they have in the supply chain. So that risk assessment done by companies gives an indication to the investors as to they're on top of the game in terms of assessing some of the risks, right? And then again, also looking at assessing opportunities. Are companies looking at some of the emission reduction opportunities within their own production as well as the entire value chain? That again sends the right signals to investors that the companies are doing the right thing. But more than that, I think also commitments towards some of the science-based targets initiative, with near-term targets to 2030 or net zero targets 2050 also sends the right signals. But even on top of that, investors also want to see the transition plans. How are these companies going to get there? How are they going to meet their near-term targets in 2030? How are they going to meet their long-term targets in 2050? And that comes from good disclosure. And good disclosure also leads to good governance. So all of these factors together can be a good outlook for investors to understand if the companies are doing the right thing and whether the investments are secure.
Yeah, interested to hear the governance point there at the end as well. I thought that would come through. One angle I wanted to also talk about in this conversation is that of the plant-based food industry. We know that plant-based food producers can be significantly less environmentally impactful and demanding than their meat and dairy producing counterparts. Is it fair to assume that plant-based food manufacturers would therefore generally be seen as a more secure investment moving forward?
Yeah, I think from a climate and biodiversity perspective, if you look at plant-based proteins, alternative proteins, I think they have less of a risk or impact from a climate and nature perspective. So from that angle, obviously, I think it is quite an attractive investment moving forward. But at the same time, at FAIRR, we don't look at silver bullets. We look at the entire value chain. So a lot of the emissions that come, or biodiversity impacts that come from agricultural production, 70 to 80% comes from the animal sort of production side. So we also look at some of the opportunities like regenerative agriculture, but also food loss and food waste is something that's also prominent. So I think it's a whole gamut of solutions across the value chain that we look at. So we don't focus on one, but all of these have to come together, speak to each other to unlock agri-food system transformation.
And when it comes to let's talk about unlocking it then and those solutions and how they can be scaled up, what work is sort of being done then, or perhaps can be done but isn't right now at an investor level and also perhaps at a government and even business level to shift us towards a more climate aligned food system?
I think at investor level, like I said, I think there needs to be an understanding of company practices. They need to look at company disclosures, company performance, etc., and factor that into their own portfolios and align some of their portfolios to understand the risks that these companies pose, that the operations pose, but also engagement. I think we also have a collaborative engagement program where we facilitate a two-way dialogue between companies and investors so that investors can use the influence to change corporate practices. So I think that sort of engagement from investors is also very much required. From a company perspective, again, understanding their own operations and the risk that poses, that will be scope 1 when it comes to emissions, but also understanding the supply chain, right? The scope 3 side, which is quite difficult because you need to have supply engagement programs, etc. And then you can understand your whole materiality of the climate change it poses on your operations. From the government side, I think that's also very important. So regulations really help. So we saw the EU deforestation regulation that came through, where they said that they would ban the import and export of products associated with deforestation. I think that's pretty strong in terms of sending a signal. We also see incentive-based programs from the government, like the Environmental Land Management Scheme in the UK, which incentivizes land management practices, which is good for both climate and nature. Also, there is a role that governments can play in sort of providing a level playing field for private investors and companies by removing some of the harmful subsidies that incentivizes intensive farming. So I think if they remove that, then changing to some of the beneficial practices becomes more attractive in terms of investment.
Maybe we'll come back onto the government point in a moment, but I wanted to bring this topic back round to that of nature and biodiversity. Where does nature come into play here? I mean, you mentioned regenerative aquaculture, perhaps that's an example, and how can kind of embracing nature positivity impact investment into the global food system?
Yeah, I think nature and climate are interestingly linked. So I think you can't look at nature and biodiversity or nature and climate in silos. For instance, due to climate impacts, you could have extreme events leading to soil erosion, like your floods washing away the soils, which affects soil health, which is a biodiversity metric. And if you have poor soils, then you need to have additional land to grow the food, which means that you're causing land use change, leading to more climate change. So there is a linkage between both of them. And I think in terms of opportunities, there is a huge conversation around nature-based solutions, which looks at both climate and nature. And you mentioned regenerative agriculture, which is one of the methods or strategies that can bring both climate and nature together, and other nature-based solutions that can come together, which sort of prioritizes both of them together. And then we need holistic solutions moving forward. And with the release of TNFD, the Task Force of Nature and Financial Disclosures, and science-based targets for nature, there is a movement from the other side, in terms of corporate standards, forcing companies to consider these together, and these are closely aligned with TCFD, for instance. So all of these come together to look at the climate nature sort of integral climate nature linkages, and that is super important, I think, moving forward.
And I guess that kind of brings us back round here to this COP then, in terms of the next steps that need to happen really at a policy, regulatory level and a business level. What does a good COP look like for you in relation to everything we've just been talking about? Is there a particular policy or framework or movement that you're hoping to see come from these negotiations?
I'll start with some bad news. We are here, the global stocktake, very important COP, right? In terms of what we agreed to do in 2018. In 2023, we're not there, which is not great. And when it comes to food and agriculture, it's kind of depressing a bit to see not a lot of mention of agriculture and emission reductions in the global stocktake. And we really hope that comes through when the final document is released. But there is acknowledgement in this COP in terms of the importance of food and agriculture, because it is, it leads to around a third of the global greenhouse gas emissions, is a leading driver of biodiversity loss, also has health and animal welfare impacts. So dedicated days in this COP for health, nature and food is a good step forward, which is not the case previously. So that is great. We also see some small initiatives coming through in terms of action agenda on regenerative landscapes, which is really great to sort of amplify, aggregate and expedite the movement towards regenerative agriculture, which brings together climate and nature again together, which is really good. It's small now, but I think it has the potential to grow a bit longer. And in terms of what we're most excited about is the food and agricultural organizations' agricultural roadmap. That's something that we led on at FAIRR, where we asked the food and agricultural organizations to provide an agricultural roadmap. So we had an investor statement that we put out, which is signed on by investors worth around $18 trillion. So the FAO has responded and they've agreed to release an agricultural roadmap. And the importance of that for investors is because it provides clear milestones and markers for investors to align their portfolios to understand the climate risks, as well as some of the opportunities to enable agri-food system transformation, right? And this sort of a roadmap and the guidance is super important coming from the FAO to align both company and investor practices to unlock agri-food system transformation.
Yeah, hugely important, which means the next few days here are hugely important as well.
Just add one more small point. I mean, again, I don't want to end on a depressing note, but we see a lot of commitments. But what I'm concerned about at FAIRR and what we try to do is, does it lead to execution? there shouldn't be a gap between commitments and execution. I mean, we talked about the global stock take, and some of these commitments are wonderful, but we really want to see implementation, action, execution, and that's something that we do at FAIRR to amplify some of that execution implementation, using our investor influence to push companies to do the right thing, to make sure that policies are in place to help investors and companies align and do the right thing.
I think that's the point really coming out of this COP, is turning these kind of global ambitions, if we do have the ambitions that are set, into actions, and it's great to hear that FAIRR are on board with driving that. Sajeev, Mo and Kumar, this has been a really insightful chat. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, thanks a lot.
Yes, thank you very much to Eva and to Sajeev there. I think we've covered Nature Day rather nicely, if I do say so myself. Now, we're almost through with today's episode of COP28 covered, but for that all-important listener segment delivered up by Sarah George, listeners from yesterday's show will recall that Sarah made the huge call to swap out the listener quiz for her new Stocktake story time, and she's been asking listeners to send in their most inspirational or funny stories from in and around COP. Basically, I think Sarah was struggling with jet lag here and in need of some bedtime stories to send her off. So, Sarah, 2 questions as I hand over to you. Did we have any takers, and will we be doing one last listener quiz?
Yes, so it wouldn't be an episode of COP28 covered without a chance for our listeners to get involved. Essentially, I was a bit bored of just firing questions at you guys and getting one-word answers back in my inbox, because I know so many of you are having great experiences at COP28 and also are working on some super interesting and exciting stuff. We wanted to hear a bit more about that. So yesterday we asked for your Stocktake story times. We asked people to send in their experiences at this COP so far, and the one that inspired Luke the most, or interested Luke the most, would get picked as the winner. And for the winner of today's Eco Voucher, he selected Jamie Farndale, the International Rugby Sevens captain. He's also studying sustainability at the University of Cambridge. He dropped us a line on LinkedIn to say that he really enjoyed being in Dubai at the same time as the Rugby World Sevens series opened. He said he used his day off for training to talk about sport and sustainability with WWF, the Sports for Future Association, and Impact. He says he wants to see some big steps taken forward over the next couple of weeks on and off the pitch. So Jamie, an Eco Voucher will be winging its way to you. In terms of today's listener feature, we only have one £10 Eco Voucher to give away. I think we went a bit too keen in the initial stages of this podcast, just as the presidency maybe went over the top with side declarations in the first few days. So we have a question to end all questions, which I'm sure a few people are starting to think about as we head towards the home stretch for this COP. So our final listener quiz is, what time will this COP finish? So we're looking for the day and time. The presidency wants this to finish at 11 a.m. Dubai time on the 12th of December. But there has been a trend towards COPs running more and more overtime over the years. COP28 in Glasgow finished more than a whole day over time. So bear that in mind when you have a guess. So email in your day and time to podcast@fav-house.com. That's FAV-house.com. And once COP closes, the closest will win a prize. So very best of luck to everyone. Back to you in the Dubai studio, Luke.
Yeah, great question. Now, I do have one bit of prior knowledge here, which might help, because I think the longest ever COP was that of COP25 in Madrid, which ran 2 days over, I think, or so I heard in the media centre earlier on. So hopefully this one doesn't follow suit. Email in those predictions to podcast@fav-house.com. And I think that's a wrap for this special nature-themed episode of the show. Will we be back with another episode of COP28 covered tomorrow, Sunday? I actually don't know, because today is actually my last day here on the ground in Dubai, would you believe? It's been emotional, but I'm determined not to say my final goodbyes just yet, because it is the all-important Food and Agriculture Day tomorrow, and we have managed to speak with quite a few people about that topic over the last couple of days. I also did say that I had a plant-based rant that I needed to get off my chest in an earlier episode. So we will do our best to bring you a Sunday special of the podcast before I head back home. And of course, Matt and Sarah are going to be keeping on top of all the day's announcements on the ed.net website, so stay tuned to that. Have a great Saturday night, everyone. I'm off to enjoy my last night here in Dubai. And until next time, it is a goodbye from me. Goodbye.